Good morning, Nigeria. Welcome to today's newspaper review. Let's take a look at the top news making today's headlines. Firstly, we'll start from the Matrix newspaper. On the Matrix newspaper, which is boldly written on page 2 on insecurity, Senate approves police trust fund budget for 2025 and 2026. At the top of the newspaper on page 3, Presidency hails classification of Nigerian stock markets as best performing in dollar terms. Still in the same newspaper on page 3, fresh group of Nigerians evacuated from South Africa arrive Lagos. These on xenophobic attacks in South Africa. At the bottom of the newspaper on entertainment, Burna Boy must pay for offending me, says Brimo. To read that story, go to page 23 of the newspaper. On sport, World Cup, Mbappe, Dembele sent France into semi-final. To read more on that story, go to page 25 of the Matrix newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Daily Trust. On the Daily Trust, which is boldly written, more than 50 days after, families of Oyo, Bonu peoples still waiting. We just hope that they bring back them home. To read more on that story, go to page 3 and 4 of the Daily Trust newspaper. At the top of the newspaper, US releases names, photographs of Nigeria on deportation list. US releases names, photograph of Nigerians on deportation list. To read more on that story, go to page 8 of the newspaper. On page 5 of the Daily Trust newspaper, how thugs killed Islamic teacher in Bauchi. This is a very sad one. At the bottom of the newspaper on page 17, Nigerian stock overtakes South Korea as world's best performing. Nigerian stock overtakes South Korea as world's best performing. Away from that newspaper to The Guardian. On The Guardian newspaper on page 4 and 5, the big story. How slush funds change fortunes. Realities of real estate businesses. To read more on that story, go to page 4 and 5 of the newspaper. At the top of the newspaper, soldiers' minimum wage now 100,000 monthly. Soldiers' minimum wage now 100,000 monthly. Defense Minister reveals. To read more on that story on soldiers' minimum wage, you go to page 3 of the Guardian newspaper. On page 3, still on page 3, on the Guardian newspaper on xenophobic attacks, reps reject call to suspend ties with South Africa. To read more, to know why reps reject calls to suspend ties with South Africa, go to page 3 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, Tinubu meets security chiefs as ADC insists federal government, APC focused on PUS. To read more on that story, go to page 6 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the Punch newspaper. On the Punch newspaper on page 2, which is boldly written, Tinubu meets security chiefs amid troops' salary backlash. At the top of the newspaper, on page 2, state police, government back reform, SDP rejects Gbajabiamila on panel. Still in the same newspaper, Dangote refinery sourced 22% of June crude from overseas. To read more on that story, go to page 19 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper on page 29, Tinubu unveils grassroots movement, defense economic reforms. And on page 4 and 5 of the newspaper, which is written, US names 124 Nigerians for deportation. Away from that newspaper to the New Telegraph. On the New Telegraph in page 2, 3, 7, 21 and 28, which is boldly written, bandits threaten to kill Oyo peoples if troops advance. This is coming from the defense minister saying that bandits are threatening to kill the Oyo school pupils and teachers if troops attack. At the top of the newspaper, telecoms amid hardships, subscribers spent 1.147 trillion naira on data in 4 months. To read more on that story, go to page 3 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, Nothing should happen to Obi. Atiku tells federal government. This is coming from Atiku. That nothing should happen to Peter Obi, the presidential candidate for the NDC. To read more on that story, go to page 5, 6, and 10. At the bottom of the newspaper, Interpol arrests 5,811 Yahoo boys, recovers $293 million in Nigeria and 96 other countries. To read more on that story, go to page 2, 4, and 6 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper on xenophobic attacks, reps ask federal government to sever ties with South Africa. To read more on that story, go to page 4 of the New Telegraph paper. Away from that newspaper to the Daily Sun. On the Daily Sun in page 6, which is boldly written still on xenophobia, reps seek review of bilateral relations with South Africa. At the top of the newspaper, still on page 6, governors, senators differ on state police funding. To read more on that, you go to page 6 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper on 2027, nothing must happen to Obi, Atiku warns. This is coming from Atiku, that nothing should happen to Obi. To read more on that story, go to page 6 and 28 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, US releases list of Nigerians set for deportation. To read more on that story, go to page 27 as US releases list of Nigerians set for deportation. Away from that newspaper to the Daily Monitor. On the Daily Monitor newspaper, which is boldly written, paying ransom only fuels kidnapping, other criminal activities. Coming from Zamfara governor, he says, paying ransom only fuels kidnapping and other criminal activities. How true is this statement that he just made? At the top of the newspaper, still on insecurity, Senate approves 2025-2026 Police Trust Fund budget. To read more on that, you go to page 2 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, I won't betray Nigerians' trust. Reforms will deliver better future. This is coming from President Bola Ahmed Tinubu, that he won't betray Nigerians' trust, that reforms will deliver in better future. Away from that newspaper to the Hope newspaper. On the Hope newspaper on page 2, which is boldly written, US set to deport 124 convicted Nigerians. At the top of the newspaper, I sold cakes, orders in my university days. Coming from Funke Akindele, a Nigerian actress. To read more on that story, go to page 12 and 13 of the newspaper. Still on page 2 of the newspaper at the top, Senate okays 403.1 billion naira to strengthen police operations and infrastructure. To read more on that story, go to page 2 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, Ondo tops health indices, beats 2030 child survival goal. Ondo State tops health indices, beats 2030 child survival goal. To read more on that story, you go to see on page 2 of the Hope newspaper. And that's all for today's newspaper review. Thank you for watching and stay tuned for more updates. I'm Chidera Esom. Do have a beautiful day.